Gold digger marries my dad 2 years before his death, and now she expects to take over his estate. I need to vent. This whole situation has been eating me up inside, and I don't even know where to start. My dad, who was always such a strong, independent man, passed away last year, leaving behind a mess I never expected. But what really stings is how a woman, who is practically a stranger, now thinks she can walk away with everything my dad ever worked for. For some background, my dad was 68 when he passed away. He was always in decent health, took care of himself, stayed active, and lived a pretty good life. My mom passed away about 10 years ago, and though it was hard on him, he stayed single for a long time. That is until 2 years ago, when she came into the picture. Let's call her Susan. Susan is probably around 45, and she came into my dad's life suddenly. I didn't think much of it at first because, hey, he was lonely, and who am I to judge? But something about her always felt off. She was overly sweet, way too nice, and always around when it came to discussing anything financial. I remember the first time I met her. She wouldn't stop asking about what my dad owned, how much money he had saved, and what kind of life insurance he had in place. Red flags, right? My sister and I, let's call her Jessica, noticed this from the start, but we didn't want to make my dad feel uncomfortable. We gently tried to talk to him about it, but he just brushed it off. "She's not after my money," he'd say, laughing it off like it was no big deal. "She cares about me." And of course, being the stubborn man he was, he refused to listen to any concerns. I guess love blinds you. Even at 68. Fast forward to 2 years later. My dad's health took a sudden turn, something none of us were prepared for. One day he was fine, and then the next he was in and out of the hospital, dealing with heart issues. Things spiraled so fast. Before we knew it, we were discussing his will and final wishes. It was heartbreaking. He made it clear that everything he owned, the house, the savings, his business, was to be split between me and Jessica as per his original will, which was set up years ago when my mom was still alive. But here's where things got shady. Susan began hanging around the hospital more and more, whispering to him, trying to convince him that she should be taken care of. She'd say things like, "I'm the one who's been here for you the past 2 years. I deserve something for my loyalty." It made me sick. But my dad, even though he was very ill, wasn't stupid. He didn't change his will, despite her constant nagging. Sadly, my dad passed away a few months later. We were devastated, of course, but it wasn't long after his funeral that Susan started making moves. She went from playing the grieving widow to demanding answers about the estate. She asked for copies of his will and wanted to know exactly how much money was in his accounts. Mind you, they were only married for 2 years, and the will was very clear. She wasn't entitled to anything beyond a small allowance my dad had left for her, out of kindness. But Susan wasn't having it. She tried to argue that she had rights as his wife and deserved a large portion of the estate. She even hired a lawyer to contest the will, claiming that since they were married, she was entitled to half of everything. Can you imagine? This woman swoops in, spends 2 years married to my dad, and suddenly thinks she owns everything he worked his whole life for. It didn't take long for things to get nasty. Susan started spreading rumors, telling people that we were trying to steal what was rightfully hers. She said we were greedy and that we only cared about money. It was insane. Meanwhile, Jessica and I were just trying to honor our dad's wishes and move forward with our lives. But Susan made that impossible. She dragged us into court, filed multiple motions, and tried to block us from accessing any of my dad's assets. She even went as far as changing the locks on my dad's house, the house we grew up in, and refused to let us in. We had no choice but to fight back legally. It was exhausting, both emotionally and financially. My dad's estate wasn't worth millions, but it was everything he had worked for. His business, his house, his savings, all of it was meant to be passed down to us. And here was this woman, who barely knew him, trying to take it all. The court battle dragged on for months. Susan tried every trick in the book to make it seem like she was entitled to more than she was. Her lawyer argued that since they were married, she was entitled to spousal rights and that she should inherit half of everything. But luckily, my dad's will was rock solid. He had set it up years before Susan even came into the picture, and his lawyer made sure that it was all airtight. In the end, justice prevailed. The court ruled in our favor, stating that Susan was only entitled to what was specifically mentioned in the will, a small monthly allowance, nothing more. The house, the business, the savings, it all went to us, just like my dad wanted. But even after losing in court, Susan didn't give up. She kept trying to drag us back into legal battles, trying to find loopholes and ways to get more money. But by then, we had enough of her nonsense. It's been a year since all of this went down, and while things have settled, the bitterness lingers. Susan eventually gave up her attempts to steal my dad's estate, but the damage was done. She turned what should have been a time of grieving into a nightmare. My dad deserved better. He didn't deserve to have his final years tainted by someone who only cared about what she could get from him. Looking back, I wish I had been more vocal about my concerns when Susan first came into my dad's life. But hindsight is 20/20, right? I just hope that anyone reading this can learn from my experience. If someone seems too interested in what your loved one has, pay attention to that red flag. People like Susan will stop at nothing to take advantage of others, and it's heartbreaking to watch it happen to someone you care about. As for me and Jessica, we're finally getting back on our feet. We've moved on from the legal battles and are focusing on preserving my dad's legacy. We still miss him every day, but at least we know we did everything we could to honor his wishes. And that's what matters most.